Today, I'm going over the section in Chapter 3 called Error and the Ego. The abilities you now possess are only shadows of your real strength. All of your present functions are divided and open to question and doubt. This is because you are not certain how you will use them and are therefore incapable of knowledge. You are also incapable of knowledge because you can still perceive lovelessly. Perception did not exist until the separation introduced degrees, aspects, and intervals. Spirit has no levels, and all conflict arises from the concept of levels. So the reason that the abilities that we possess are only shadows of our real strength is because here in the illusory world, when we think that we're egos and we don't know the truth of the spirit of who and what we truly are, then we are not experiencing our real strength. We are only experiencing shadows of it, a distortion of it from our ego perception in this illusory world. The reason that we are not certain how we will use these functions that we have is because we are incapable of knowledge, is because we're not certain who and what we really are and what we're really doing here. The reason we are still incapable of knowledge is because we still perceive lovelessly, all right? We are not perceiving the truth of who and what we really are. We're not perceiving the truth of the spirit of what everyone and everything is, and that we are one with everything and that we are only love. We do not know that. And that's why we are perceiving lovelessly. It's telling us that before the separation, there was no perception. It didn't exist. It's only the ego that made up perception. And in perception, that introduced this idea of degrees, aspects, and intervals. Okay? In truth, those things don't exist. Because it says spirit has no levels. And all conflict arises from this belief in levels. It's a mistake. It's not real. Then it's telling us only the levels of the Trinity are capable of unity. All right, Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Now, these three aspects of the Trinity are really one. But within the illusory world, we pretend that there are these three characters to help us to wake up from the dream, the mistaken dream that we're having. When we listen to the voice of Holy Spirit, and therefore know that we are the child of God and understand that God or source creation is our parent, this is when we come into unity because we understand that all of those things are one. So that's why only the levels of the Trinity are capable of unity. The levels created by the separation cannot but conflict. All right. So when we believe in separation, we can only experience conflict. There is no other result that's going to happen from that other than conflict. It says this is because they are meaningless to each other. You can't have both the ego perception of separation and the spirit's perception of oneness. They don't go together. Next paragraph says, consciousness, the level of perception, was the first split introduced into the mind after the separation, making the mind a perceiver rather than a creator. So we are naturally creators just like God. We naturally have a desire to extend love just like God. But in our mistaken world, instead of extending love, we are extending projection. And so when our mind appeared to split for the very first time, remember there is no such thing as time. So this is still just a story. But in our story, we had this split in our mind. And when we had this split in our mind, when we had the tiny mad idea and we thought, I wonder what it would be like to be separate from God, that's when we had this split in our mind. And that is when consciousness was born, it is telling us. Before that mistaken idea, there was no such thing as consciousness. There was only beingness. There was only the extension of love. But once we had this ego perception, once we were in fear and our mind split, and suddenly we had conscious, we had something to be conscious of, that's when the projection began. This is what consciousness is. It was a projecting out, a splitting of ourselves. So consciousness, the level perception, was the first split introduced into the mind after the separation, making the mind a perceiver rather than a creator. Because in our natural state, we naturally want to create, we want to extend love. But in our mistaken split mind, we became the perceiver. Suddenly there's something to be conscious of within consciousness, and we are now perceiving something else. There is an other out there, something to be afraid of. Consciousness is correctly identified as the domain of the ego. Okay? Consciousness equals ego. They're the same thing. The ego is a wrong-minded attempt to perceive yourself as you wish to be. Okay, we wish in our ego mind frame to be separate from God. We want to be independent. We want to be the boss. So when we're in wrong-minded thinking, we are perceiving ourselves as we wish to be rather than as you are, he tells us. Because what are we? We are pure spirit. We are love. Yet you can know yourself only as you are because that is all you can be sure of. Everything else is open to question, meaning everything else is illusion. Everything else isn't really here. The only thing that's real is the love, the spirit, the true extension of who and what we really are. The ego is the questioning aspect of the post-separation self. Okay, so all the questioning and doubt is coming from the ego, which was made rather than created. All right, the ego was not created. Creation only comes from God. We made the ego mistakenly with our mind. It is capable of asking questions, but not of perceiving meaningful answers. So, like, there's another line in the Course that says, the ego's motto is seek and do not find. This is saying the same thing. It loves to ask questions. It loves to seek and ask questions, but it never finds the answers, right? It can never perceive any kind of meaningful answers because these would involve knowledge and cannot be perceived. So remember, as we learned before from the previous section, that knowledge cannot be perceived. We only have knowledge when we have received atonement and are in communion with God. The mind is therefore confused because only one-mindedness can be without confusion. The only time we're not confused is when we know that we are pure spirit, when we know who and what we really are. A separated or divided mind must be confused. As long as we are seeing things with ego perception, we will always be confused. It is necessarily uncertain about what it is. Okay, we're confused about who we are and what we are when we are in our ego. It has been in conflict because it is out of accord with itself. Okay, the ego is in conflict because it is out of accord with what it really is, which is true spirit. The ego isn't even real. So it's in conflict with itself all the time because it wants to keep living its pretend perceived illusion. But inside, there is a part of us that knows that that is not who we are. And therefore, we continue to be in conflict until we accept our truth, until we accept the atonement, until we accept God's love. This makes its aspects strangers to each other, and this is the essence of the fear-prone condition in which attack is always possible. You have every reason to feel afraid as you perceive yourself. This is why you cannot escape from fear until you realize that you did not and could not create yourself. You can never make your misperceptions true, and your creation is beyond your own error. This is why you must eventually choose to heal the separation. Okay, so when we are in our ego frame of mind, we are afraid, and therefore we attack. Okay, frightened people can be vicious. We therefore attack. This is all coming from ego perception. This is all coming from projection. Because we are so lost and confused in our ego thought system, we need the Christ consciousness part of our mind to help us to heal. From the ego frame of mind, we cannot do it ourselves. We are lost and confused and frightened. So we have to surrender that part of our mind to Christ consciousness. You can call it Jesus. You can imagine it as another being, entity, person, man, guide, friend, whatever, however you want to imagine it, that makes you feel comfortable and makes you feel safe. But really, it's just the Christ consciousness aspect of our mind. It's our higher self. It's the part of ourself that knows the truth. We need to open our mind to that part of ourself and allow that part of ourself to heal us, to help us know who and what we really are, to help us remove the blocks to God's love. And when we understand that we did not create ourselves, that the ego is not something real because it was not created, creation only comes from God. And we can only create when we are one with God, when we are creating from God's will. So that's why it says we cannot escape from fear until we realize that we did not and could not have created ourselves. Next paragraph says, right-mindedness is not to be confused with the knowing mind because it is applicable only to right perception. You can be right-minded or wrong-minded. And even this is subject to degrees, clearly demonstrating that knowledge is not involved. Okay, so knowledge is something that we can only experience when we have fully removed all blocks to God's love, when we fully and completely know who and what we really are. The term right-mindedness is properly used as the correction for wrong-mindedness and applies to the state of mind that induces accurate perception. It is miracle-minded because it heals misperception, and this is indeed a miracle in view of how you perceive yourself. All right, all fancy words to mean that when we are in our ego frame of mind, which most of us are all the time, we are completely confused. We do not know who we are, and we are frightened. And that is wrong-mindedness. And the only way to heal is through the miracle. And the miracle is overlooking the world of form to see the truth of who and what everything and everyone really is, which is pure spirit, which is pure love. So only by practicing miracles, by practicing that right-minded perception over and over and over again, that is practicing forgiveness, that is the miracle. And when we do that, that is the only shot we have to wake up. It is the only avenue that we can take to wake up. It is the only path that we can take to wake up. Perception always involves some misuse of the mind, because that's what the ego does. It misuses the mind because it brings the mind into areas of uncertainty. All right, that's what the ego does. That's its whole job, is to be uncertain, afraid, to project and attack. That's what the ego does. The mind is very active, he's telling us. When it chooses to be separated, it chooses to perceive. All right, perception is wrong-mindedness. Perception is what egos do. Egos perceive. Until then, it wills only to know. Okay, we desire to know our true selves. We desire the truth. Afterwards, it can only choose ambiguously, and the only way out of ambiguity is clear perception. So even though perception is still a function within the illusion, we use it as a tool to have clear perception, to have right-minded thinking, to remind ourselves of the truth. Once we are finally awake, we no longer need perception. There's nothing to perceive because there's just being. There's just being pure love and extending pure love eternally. But until we remember that that's our true essence of who we are, we're going to continue to use this thing called perception. And we can either perceive wrongly or correctly, ego thoughts or spirit thoughts. The mind returns to its proper function only when it wills to know. This places it in the service of spirit, because it is from spirit that it derives its whole power to make or create. Make meaning ego, create meaning spirit. So within us, when we get to the place where we think, oh, there must be a better way. I know there's something else for me to understand about who and what I really am and who and what this world really is. When we get to that place and we have that tiny spark of light inside of us, this is when we desire to know. And this is when we start to desire to create instead of to make. Meaning being in our right mind versus our wrong mind. Even in miscreation, the mind is affirming its source, or it would merely cease to be. Okay, that is reinforcing what we learned in the last section, talking about we only have two choices, right-minded or wrong-minded, but when we choose wrong-minded, which we all are because we appear to be here, when we choose that, there is still always some spark of light in there, some bit of truth that we can never lose. And what he's telling us is, if that were true, that we lost it all when we're in wrong-minded thinking and that there's no way home, then we would simply cease to be. So the only reason we still appear to be here is because we are miscreating And because who we really are within the illusion, that spark of light is still there, that knowingness that is still whispering to us. Okay, that's Holy Spirit whispering it into our ear. That's Holy Spirit whispering to us, telling us who and what we really are. That's the voice for God that gets us out of this illusion. It's the tether that leads us back home to heaven, which is the state of oneness with one another and with God's source creation. This is impossible, it says, in order for us to cease to be, because the mind belongs to spirit, which God created and which is therefore eternal. So because we are really eternal and we are really one with God, it is impossible for us to cease to be. Okay? We are eternal beings, eternally extending love. The ability to perceive made the body possible because you must perceive something with something. That is why perception involves an exchange or translation, which knowledge does not need. Okay, so this whole process of perceiving and levels and degrees and all of that stuff, it's all coming from the illusion. It's coming from the ego thought system. When we know who we really are and we are fully awake, we no longer need to perceive because we are simply being. We are in our true state of being. But as long as we think we are here, we're going to continue to perceive. And we can either perceive correctly, right-minded thinking, or incorrectly, wrong-minded thinking. The interpretive function of perception, a distorted form of creation, okay, because remember, perception's only happening when we're here in this distorted, illusory world. It then permits you to interpret the body as yourself in an attempt to escape from the conflict you have induced. This is what the ego wants to do. It wants to interpret our bodies as ourselves so that it can escape from the deep unconscious guilt. This is the conflict he's talking about. We have deep unconscious guilt that we destroyed God in heaven. Spirit, which knows, could not be reconciled with this loss of power because it is incapable of darkness. So God is incapable of darkness. The truth of who we are, the spirit that we really are, is incapable of darkness. It is incapable of misperceiving. It is incapable of being an ego. This makes spirit almost inaccessible to the mind and entirely inaccessible to the body. Okay, because from an ego framework, we cannot understand spirit. We cannot understand who we are. Therefore, spirit is perceived as a threat, because light abolishes darkness merely by showing you it is not there. All right, so the ego is continuously going to consider light, love, spirit, this information in this book as a threat. It will always see it as a threat because it wants to continue living in its illusory world, believing that it is separate and that it has power. It wants to keep believing that because it is afraid, because it is in conflict, and it's trying to protect itself by attacking and projecting. The ego does not want the darkness to be abolished by the light. Truth will always overcome error in this way. So it doesn't matter how long of a temper tantrum the ego puts up or how long the ego wants to deny the truth will never go away. It cannot be destroyed. We are only procrastinating. It's up to us how quickly we want to learn these concepts and practice them or deny them and continue to live in illusion, in painful illusion. This cannot be an active process of correction because, as I have already emphasized, knowledge does not do anything. Okay? The activity, the doing, that is all coming from the ego frame of mind. Being is what spirit is. So that's why it says knowledge does not do anything, because knowledge is being the eternal extension of love. It can be perceived as an attacker, but it cannot attack, right? So this eternal extension of love, spirit, what we're talking about, it can be perceived as an attacker, right? By the ego. That's what the ego thinks of it, but it cannot attack. Spirit cannot attack. What you perceive as its attack is your own vague recognition that knowledge can always be remembered, never having been destroyed. So what Jesus is telling us here is, because there is a part of us that knows the truth, we are terrified of the light. We are terrified of the truth because the ego aspect of us does not want to die. God and his creations remain in surety, and therefore know that no miscreation exists. All right, so here's the good news at the end of this section, is that despite all that was just described here about our ego thought system and how it behaves and how it's constantly confused and misperceiving and attacking and projecting, that despite all of that, the truth is that no miscreation exists. None of that really exists. Truth cannot deal with errors that you want. I, meaning Jesus, was a man who remembered spirit and its knowledge. Okay, so what he's telling us is during his lifetime over 2,000 years ago, Jesus remembered spirit, remembered knowledge, remembered the truth. As a man, I did not attempt to counteract error with knowledge, but to correct error from the bottom up. I demonstrated both the powerlessness of the body and the power of the mind. By uniting my will with that of my Creator, I naturally remembered spirit in its real purpose. So what Jesus is telling us here is that when he lived here as a man, as a human on the planet, that he united his will with that of the Creator, of God, of his, what he called his Father. Remember, there is no gender. Okay, gender is a duality concept. Duality isn't real. So father, mother, parent, these words can all be replaced with each other. But when Jesus was here on the planet and he was practicing miracles, practicing forgiveness, he understood how to be fully dependent on God, how to only recognize spirit in himself and in everyone else, because he was fully dependent on God. He was fully dependent on right-mindedness, on Holy Spirit's thought system. Because he was practicing forgiveness, which is the same as practicing miracles, he remembered spirit and its real purpose. He remembered who and what he and everyone else really was, and our real purpose here, which is simply to wake up from this dream so we can go home to God, where we already are. We just forgot. We just blocked that knowledge. I cannot unite your will with God's for you, but I can erase all misperceptions from your mind if you will bring it under my guidance. So he has told us this before as we've been covering the text, is that he can't just do it for us. He can't just come in and take over our mind for us. We have to give our mind to him. We have to do that so that he can erase all misperceptions. When we give our mind to him and put it under his guidance, or you can think of it as yourself and your own Christ consciousness, when you give your mind to that, this is what takes your misperceptions away. This is what allows you to see correctly. Without them, your choice is certain. Sane perception induces sane choosing. I cannot choose for you, but I can help you make your own right choice. All right, so we just need to give our mind over to Jesus, over to Christ consciousness, and then Christ consciousness or Jesus will help us make the right choice. All right, so now he's telling us that the quote from the Bible, "Many are called, but few are chosen," is actually not correct. And what it should say is, "All are called, but few choose to listen." Therefore, they do not choose right. The chosen ones are merely those who choose right sooner, okay? Because we're all waking up, all right? As it tells us in the introduction of this course, this is a required course. We're all going to be learning this at some point. It's just up to us how quickly or how slowly we want to do it, all right? So that's why it says the chosen ones, meaning those who choose to listen, who choose to hear Holy Spirit's voice. Those who choose to listen, those chosen ones, are merely those who choose right sooner. So what it's saying is we are all chosen ones. Remember, there's only one of us, okay? We are all the chosen one. But the chosen ones in this illusion are the ones who are choosing to listen and choosing to wake up. Eventually, everyone is going to be a chosen one. Everyone will eventually hear the voice for God. Right minds can do this now, and they will find rest unto their souls. So Jesus is reminding us that we can choose correctly right now. We can have this peace now, that it will bring us peace and joy and happiness to choose our right mind, to have right-minded thinking now. So if we choose to be a chosen one right now and open up and listen to Holy Spirit, listen to the voice for God, know that there is another way, know that there's another way to perceive, which is what practicing miracles is. It's what practicing forgiveness is. Okay, overlooking the world of form and knowing who and what we really are, which is the eternal extension of love. We can choose this now, is what Jesus is telling us. The last sentence says, God knows you only in peace, and this is your reality. All right? That is our truth. We are one with God. We are peace, and we are all innocent. That is your truth. That is all of our truth. That is who we all really are.